There is a story that has been told about Australia for more than 200 years. It is a story of a vast, ancient land populated by people who lived simply, who moved with the seasons, who left no permanent mark on the earth, no cities, no monuments, no stone structures rising against the sky. The story said these were hunter-gatherers in the most elemental sense, a people whose relationship with the land was real and profound, but whose material culture was minimal and permanent. Leaving nothing behind, that story was wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong in minor details that historians debate in conference rooms, wrong in the way that changes everything, wrong in the way that means we have been looking at one of the oldest living civilizations on the planet and telling ourselves for 2 centuries that there was nothing to see. There are standing stones in Victoria aligned to the winter solstice sunrise with the precision of an observatory. There are fish trap systems in New South Wales, so vast and so old that archaeologists believe they were being used 40,000 years before anyone laid the foundation stone of the Great Pyramid at Giza. There are stone villages in the Western District of Victoria, complete with walls, doorways and drainage channels that were occupied continuously for 6,000 years. There are quarries in the volcanic highlands that fed a trade network spanning the entire continent. There are ceremonial stone circles aligned to the stars. There are astronomical engravings cut into bedrock that map the sky as it appeared thousands of years ago. These structures exist. They have always existed. Many of them were documented by the first European settlers who arrived and looked at them and somehow did not understand what they were seeing. And the people who built them, the people who engineered fish traps out of river stone across 500 meters of flowing water, who oriented egg-shaped ceremonial arrangements to the precise moment of the summer solstice, who built permanent stone-walled villages in a country that Western science insisted had no permanent settlements. Those people have been living in Australia for at least 65,000 years. This is not a story about fringe archaeology. This is not a story about ancient aliens or lost civilizations imported from elsewhere. This is something far more extraordinary than that. This is a story about a civilization that was always here, always building, always watching the sky and reading the land and recording their knowledge in stone. A civilization so old that when the first humans were still learning to leave Africa, the ancestors of these builders were already walking the red earth of this continent. The story has been suppressed. That is the honest word. Not forgotten because it was never unknown to the people who built these things. Suppressed, dismissed, buried under a legal fiction called Terra Nullius, which held that Australia was legally empty when the British arrived, that no one owned this land because no one had truly inhabited it in any recognized sense. That fiction required a certain kind of erasure. It required that the stonefish traps of the Ngamba people be explained away as natural formations. It required that the standing stones of the Wurdi be dismissed as geological accidents. It required that 6,000 years of stone villages on the shores of Lake Condah be invisible to the colonial record. That erasure is ending, slowly, painfully, but it is ending. Tonight you're going to hear about stone. Ancient stone, worked by ancient hands, placed with ancient precision, in a land that the rest of the world was told had nothing to offer the history of human civilization. You're going to hear about 40,000 years of architectural knowledge. You're going to hear about people who were building when most of the world had not yet begun. Find a comfortable place. Let your body settle. Let your breathing slow. This is a long story. It has been a long time waiting to be told. Number 1, the Wurdi Yuang stone arrangement. There is a paddock in Victoria, about 60 kilometres southwest of Melbourne, near a town called Little River. The land here is open grassland rolling gently toward the Yuyangs, a range of low granite ridges that rise above the surrounding plain. The grass is dry in summer and green in winter. Wedge-tailed eagles circle the thermals above the ridgeline. It is ordinary Australian countryside in almost every way, and in that paddock, arranged in the shape of a large egg, are more than 90 basalt stones. The arrangement is roughly 50 metres across at its widest point. The stones vary in size. Some are small, the size of a watermelon, set flush against the ground. Others are larger, standing upright, knee height or higher. Their flat faces angled with a deliberateness that is unmistakable once you know to look for it. The egg shape is oriented along a specific axis, its widest point aligned to the east and the west, and 3 prominent stones at the western end are positioned to mark the precise moment of the summer solstice sunset, the winter solstice sunset, and the equinox sunset, with an accuracy that astonishes the astronomers who have measured it. This is Wurdi Yuang. It belongs to the Wurdi Yuang people, who call this country home and who have maintained oral traditions about this site across generations of living memory. It is the most extensively studied stone arrangement in Australia. And it is, depending on how you read the available evidence, somewhere between 11,000 and 7,000 years old. 7,000 years ago, Stonehenge did not exist. The great stone circles of Britain were not built until around 5,000 years ago. The megalithic temples of Malta appeared about the same time. The pyramids of Egypt came later still. Yet here, in this Victorian paddock, there are stones arranged with astronomical precision that predate every famous megalithic structure in the Western world. The Wurdi people were not surprised when archaeologists and astronomers began to confirm what the stones showed. They knew the knowledge was kept. Dwayne Hamaker, an astrophysicist who spent years working with Aboriginal communities on Indigenous astronomy, says the same thing again and again when he speaks about this work. The knowledge was never lost. It was simply not being listened to by the people who considered themselves qualified to judge. The way the site works is precise enough to function as a calendar. When you stand at the eastern apex of the egg shape and look west along the stone alignment, the sun sets behind the 3 marker stones at different points across the year. At the summer solstice, the southernmost marker stone frames the setting sun exactly. At the winter solstice, the northernmost stone does the same. At the equinoxes, the central stone. The angular separation between those 3 markers corresponds with mathematical accuracy to the sun's movement across the western horizon across the course of a year at this latitude. This is not coincidence. A geologist will tell you that basalt stones do not arrange themselves in egg shapes 50 meters wide with astronomical markers. Someone put these stones here. Someone measured the sky, tracked the sun across seasons, determined the precise angles required, and placed heavy stones according to a design that encoded that information permanently into the landscape. The question of who takes you somewhere extraordinary. The Wurdi Yuang people did not arrive in Australia 11,000 years ago. They have been here for tens of thousands of years before that. Wurdi Yuang is not their oldest creation. It is simply one of the ones we can date with reasonable confidence. One of the ones whose astronomical function has been confirmed by instruments. There are other stone arrangements across the continent, older and less studied, whose full significance we have not yet grasped. Eminent archaeologist John Morrison has argued that the site's astronomical precision, combined with the size and weight of the stones used, implies a sustained community project requiring organized labor, long-term planning, and inherited astronomical knowledge passed down through generations before a single stone was set. You do not build a solstice-aligned observatory on accident. You do not stumble upon the correct angles by chance. You learn them from someone who learned them from someone else, across a chain of teaching stretching back further than the structure itself. That is what a civilization does. That is what a people with a continuous intellectual and cultural tradition does. They accumulate knowledge, they test it, they encode it in permanent forms, so that the next generation does not have to start from scratch. Wurdi Yuang is not a curiosity. It is proof of something that should change the way you understand human history. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth was practicing sophisticated astronomy and encoding it in stone at a time when Europe was still emerging from the last ice age. And Wurdi Yuang is not the oldest thing we are going to discuss tonight. Number 2, the Brewarrina fish traps. There is a river in northwestern New South Wales called the Barwon. It runs through flat, dry country, through towns that came and went with the wool economy, through landscapes of sparse grey-green scrub and red dust. The Barwon is not a dramatic river. It is wide in good seasons and narrow in dry ones, moving slowly through a land that has never been generous with water. At the town of Brewarrina, the Barwon runs over a series of flat granite shelves. And in and around those shelves, the Ngamba people built something that most archaeologists now believe is the oldest human construction on the surface of the earth. The Brewarrina fish traps are a system of interconnected stone walls, channels, holding pools, and weirs stretching across nearly 500 meters of river. They are built from flat stone, carefully stacked without mortar, exploiting the natural shape of the granite shelves to create a series of enclosures that catch fish moving upstream. The design is sophisticated. Different compartments capture different species. The channel widths are calibrated to the swimming behavior of specific fish. Water flows freely through the walls, but fish cannot pass upstream without being directed into holding pools where they can be retrieved at will. This is not a simple dam or a weir. This is an engineered aquaculture system, and the Ngamba people used it to feed large gatherings from across a wide region, sometimes hundreds of people at a time, for seasonal ceremonies and trade meetings that brought many different nations together on the banks of the Barwon. How old are the Brewarrina fish traps? This is where the ground becomes both solid and contested. The traps themselves cannot be directly dated because stone does not decay in a way that allows straightforward dating. But the archaeological record around the site, the soil layers, the organic material found in association with the structures, the geological context, points toward an age of at least 40,000 years. Some estimates place the construction even earlier. There are researchers who argue, based on the sedimentary record and the accumulated geological data, that these fish traps were in use before the last ice age reshaped the continent. 40,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens had only recently reached Europe, when woolly mammoths still walked the earth, when the sea level was 100 meters lower than it is today, and the coastline of Australia extended far beyond where it does now. The Ngamba people, and those before them, were already building stone fish traps on the Barwon. The colonial record documented the Brewarrina fish traps from the early 1800s. Edward John Eyre visited in the 1840s and described them. Various explorers noted the structures and noted that the local people used them efficiently and with clear familiarity, as if these structures had been part of their lives from the beginning of memory, which of course they had. And then, as colonialism did with so many things, the official understanding of the traps became confused and then dismissive. They were attributed to natural geological formations by some observers. They were attributed to more recent construction by others. The simplest explanation, that the people who had lived there for 40,000 years had built them, was the one that the colonial record found most difficult to sustain, because that explanation was incompatible with Terra Nullius, incompatible with the story of an empty land, incompatible with the legal and moral framework that justified dispossession, that Ngemba people never forgot. The knowledge of how to maintain the traps, how to read the water levels, how to position the retaining stones after a flood moved them, was kept across generations, even through the catastrophic disruption of colonization. In recent decades, some of that knowledge has been used to restore parts of the trap system that had deteriorated. When you think about 40,000 years of continuous maintenance of a single engineered structure, something begins to shift in how you understand the word civilization. We use that word easily for societies that built things 5,000 years ago. We call the Egyptians a civilization. We call the Mesopotamians a civilization. We call the Indus Valley people a civilization. But we have spent 2 centuries struggling to apply that word to a people who were doing the same things, building the same kind of permanent infrastructure, integrating the same kind of organized communal labor 8 times as long ago. The Brewarrina fish traps are older than agriculture in the Middle East. They are older than the first cities. They are older than writing. They are one of the oldest human-made structures on the face of the planet. And they are in a small town in northwestern New South Wales, and most people have never heard of them. That is not an accident of history. That is a consequence of a story that was told on purpose. Number 3, the Lake Condah aquaculture system. Move south now, far south to the volcanic western district of Victoria, where ancient lava flows created a landscape of flat basalt plains broken by low hills, shallow lakes, and wetlands. This is Gunditjmara country, and it has been Gunditjmara country for at least 30,000 years. Lake Condah sits in this landscape, a shallow, reedy wetland fed by the Darlow Creek system and surrounded by the low, rocky rises of an ancient lava field. The area is not dramatic. There are no high mountains, no gorges, no geological spectacle. It is quiet country, windswept and brown in summer, green and wet in winter. But in and around Lake Condah, the Gunditjmara people built something so large and so sophisticated that when the full extent of it was finally mapped and understood in the early 21st century, it changed the fundamental debate about Aboriginal Australian civilization. They built an aquaculture system, not a fish trap in a river like Brewarrina, but a continent-scale engineering project spanning at least 80 square kilometers of wetland country. Stone channels, some hundreds of meters long, were cut and shaped through the volcanic rock to redirect water flow from seasonal floods. Holding pools were excavated and lined with stone. Weirs controlled water levels. Eel traps of sophisticated design were positioned at strategic points in the system, capturing short-finned eels, called kuyang in the Gunditjmara language, as they moved through the water network on their annual migration to the sea. The system produced food in quantities large enough to support a permanent settled population. And this is the part that matters most. The Gunditjmara did not move seasonally. They did not follow the animals and the plants across the landscape. They stayed. They built villages. There are stone-walled structures at Lake Condah, circular and oval, built from the flat basalt rocks of the lava field. The walls are 1 meter to 1.5 meters high. The floors are earthen. Some of the structures have doorways oriented in specific directions. Some have stone platforms inside that may have served as sleeping or storage surfaces. There are dozens of these structures distributed across the wetland landscape around the lake, clustered in patterns that suggest neighborhoods, that suggest a community organized spatially the way settled communities everywhere organize themselves. These are houses, not in a metaphorical sense, not in the sense that any temporary shelter can be called a house. These are permanent stone structures built to be occupied long-term by people who intended to stay. The dating of this system places it at 6,600 years ago for the construction of the main channels, with evidence of use and occupation extending much further back. 6,600 years ago, the people living at Lake Condah were managing a complex aquaculture operation, processing and trading preserved eels across a wide network, and living in permanent stone villages. 6,600 years ago, the Egyptian pyramids had not yet been built. The extent of the Condah system was not understood by Western archaeology until satellite imagery, aerial survey, and detailed ground mapping work began in the 1980s and accelerated in the early 2000s. When Gunditjmara elders and archaeologist Heather Bilth worked together on systematic survey in the early 2000s, the scale of what was revealed was staggering. What had been documented as isolated stone features scattered across the wetlands turned out to be components of a single coherent engineered system, one of the largest and most complex aquaculture installations of the ancient world. The UNESCO World Heritage Committee listed the Budj Bim cultural landscape, which includes the Lake Condah system, in 2019. It was the first Australian site to be listed solely for its Aboriginal cultural values. The citation noted that the Budj Bim system demonstrates outstanding universal value as one of the world's largest and oldest aquaculture systems, one of the oldest. The word oldest appears again. It keeps appearing when you study Australian Aboriginal sites, because the people who built these things have been here longer than anyone else has been anywhere. Number 4. The stone villages of the Western District. Stay in Gunditjmara country a little longer because there is more here than the water system. The stone structures at Lake Condah are the best known and most extensively studied, but they are not alone. Across the volcanic Western District of Victoria, there is evidence of a settlement pattern that upends everything the colonial narrative said about how Aboriginal people lived. The dominant story, the story taught in schools and repeated in textbooks for most of the 20th century, was that Aboriginal Australians were nomadic. All of them, universally, are people who moved constantly, following food across the landscape, who had no concept of fixed habitation, who built nothing permanent because their entire way of life was built around movement. This story was convenient. Under Terra Nullius, the legal doctrine that justified British possession of Australia, the land could only be claimed as empty if the people living in it had not occupied it in any legally recognisable sense. A nomadic people who left no permanent structures was easier to legally erase than a settled people with villages, farms, and engineered landscapes. The story of universal nomadism was not a neutral historical observation. It was a political requirement. The reality in the Western District of Victoria is different. The basalt country is studded with permanent stone structures. The Gunditjmara built in stone, not just at Lake Condah, but across a wide area of their country, using the flat volcanic rock of the lava fields with the skill and economy of people who had been doing it for generations. The structures are varied. Some are clearly domestic, circular or oval, sized for small family groups. Others are larger, potentially communal, with configurations that suggest shared functions, meeting, storage, ceremony. The structures cluster in ways that suggest permanent community organization. There are locations where multiple buildings are grouped together, where pathways between structures are visible, where the overall layout has the spatial logic of a settlement rather than the random scatter of temporary shelters. People who are planning to leave do not build with this kind of intention. People who are staying, who intend for the next generation to stay, who are building for a future they expect to inhabit, build like this. Some of these structures were documented by early settlers and dismissed. Others were not documented at all, used as convenient sources of flat stone for European fences and building foundations, dismantled without record before anyone thought to ask what they were. The loss of structural evidence in the Western District from the first decades of settlement is significant and irreversible. What survives is enough to demonstrate the pattern. This was a settled landscape. The people living here were not passing through. They had built a civilization that was rooted in place, that managed its resources with long-term planning, that supported a permanent population and permanent buildings across generations, that stretched back well before the time of Christ. Bruce Pascoe, in his controversial and important 2014 book Dark Emu, brought many of these sites into public discussion for the first time, drawing on the journals of early explorers and settlers who had actually documented what they saw before the political pressure to see nothing of significance became overwhelming. Pascoe was building on decades of academic work by archaeologists and anthropologists who had been making these arguments in specialist journals for years, but Dark Emu made the argument accessible. It put the evidence in front of a general audience. And the response was fierce because changing the story about Aboriginal Australia means changing the story about what colonization was and what it took. The stone villages of the Western District do not let you look away from that. They are permanent, they are still there. They sit in paddocks where sheep graze, and they wait for you to understand what they mean. Number 5, the Brewarrina stones and the question of 40,000 years. Let us go back to that number because it deserves more of your attention. 40,000 years. It is easy to say. It is very hard to truly feel. Let me try to give it some texture. Agriculture, the practice of growing crops deliberately and systematically, began in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East around 10,000 years ago. When humans first planted grain in Mesopotamia, the Ngamba people had already been maintaining their fish trap system on the Barwon for 30,000 years. Writing was invented in Sumer around 5,000 years ago. When the first cuneiform symbols were pressed into clay tablets, the Ngamba fish traps were already 35,000 years old. The Bronze Age, the period of metallurgy and early urban civilization in Europe and the Middle East, began around 3,500 years ago. The fish traps were 36,500 years old. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon a little over 2,000 years ago. The fish traps were 38,000 years old. The oldest building in Central Europe, the Newgrange Passage tomb in Ireland, was built around 5,200 years ago. The fish traps were 35,000 years old, and all of this is assuming the lower end of the age estimates. Some researchers argue for earlier dates still. Some of the stone features associated with the Brewarrina complex have contextual evidence suggesting use during a period when the regional climate was significantly different, when the river ran differently, when the landscape looked nothing like it does today. 40,000 years of continuous use of an engineered structure on a single river in New South Wales. Think about what that means for the people who built and maintained it. It means that knowledge was accumulated and transmitted across a span of time so vast that it encompasses every human civilization we typically recognize as historical. It was transmitted not through writing, not through stone tablets, not through bureaucratic record-keeping, but through the practices and stories and teachings of a living people. One generation to the next, across the entire span of what we call human history and well beyond. This kind of knowledge transmission requires social stability. It requires continuous community cohesion. It requires a relationship between a people and a place so durable that it survived ice ages, sea level changes, climate shifts, ecological transformations. People who are uncertain of their home, people who feel temporary in a place, do not maintain a fish trap for 40,000 years. People who know they are going to be there forever do. The question that haunts this site, the question that every archaeologist and anthropologist who has studied it eventually confronts, is what word we use for a society that maintains sophisticated engineering works across 40,000 years of continuous habitation. What word other than civilization? What word other than culture, in the deepest sense of that word, a structured, transmissible, accumulated body of knowledge about how to live in a place? There is no other word that fits, and the reason we have not used that word for 200 years says much more about us than it says about the Ngamba people. Number 6, the Mount William Quarry and the Continental Trade Network. There is a hill in the Central Highlands of Victoria, about 130 kilometres north of Melbourne, near a town called Lancefield. The hill is not particularly dramatic. It rises gently from the surrounding farmland, its slopes covered in dry grass and scattered eucalyptus. At its summit and on its flanks, outcrops of a particular kind of greenstone, a fine-grained volcanic rock, technically called metadolerite, emerge from the soil. This is Mount William, or Willemi Mooring in the Wurundjeri language, and for unknown thousands of years, it was the most important manufacturing site in southeastern Australia. The greenstone of Mount William is extraordinarily well suited to making stone axes. It is hard, fine-grained, tough without being brittle, capable of holding a sharp edge after grinding. When shaped and ground into the classic form of the Australian ground edge axe, a tool with a polished working edge created by hours of grinding against wet sandstone, it produces an implement that is far more efficient at woodworking than an unground flake stone axe. The difference in performance is significant. A ground edge axe cuts wood in a fraction of the time required by a flaked axe, and it holds its edge far longer. The Wurundjeri people managed access to the Mount William quarry site. There was a custodian family, the headmen of whom had hereditary authority over the site, who controlled quarrying rights and facilitated access for other groups. This was not informal or casual. It was a structured, hereditary custodianship of a resource that was understood to be of continental significance, and continental is the right word. Mount William greenstone has been found in archaeological sites across southeastern and eastern Australia. The distribution of these axes, traceable to this quarry by geochemical analysis of the rock, covers a territory of many hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. Axes from Mount William have been recovered at sites in Queensland, in South Australia, in New South Wales, far from the Victorian Highlands. This is not random dispersal, this is trade. Systematic, long-distance organised trade, in which greenstone axes from a specific quarry in Victoria move through exchange networks across an entire subcontinent. The axes change hands many times on their journey. Each exchange involved reciprocal goods, relationships, obligations. The network of exchanges that moved a Mount William axe from its quarry to a site in Queensland was a social and economic infrastructure connecting communities across vast distances. Norman Tyndale, the anthropologist who spent decades mapping Australian Aboriginal societies in the early and mid-20th century, documented the trade routes that connected coastal and inland communities across southeastern Australia. These were not vague pathways. They were known routes maintained over generations, with customary protocols governing travel, exchange, and conduct. They connected communities with different resources, different ecological zones, different specialised knowledge. Shell from coastal groups moved inland. Stone from highland quarries moved to the coast. Food surpluses from one region balanced scarcities in another. This is an economic system, not in the Western capitalist sense, but in the fundamental sense of organised exchange of resources and labour across a network of communities with mutually beneficial relationships. The Mount William quarry was first brought to the attention of European Australians by William Thomas, the guardian of Aborigines for the Port Phillip district, in the 1840s. Thomas documented the custodian family, the protocols governing access, and the distribution of axes. His documentation is precise and respectful by the standards of his era. He understood that he was observing a sophisticated institution. What happened to the quarry and to the trade network it anchored is a short and brutal story. By the 1860s, the traditional custodians had been dispossessed from their country. The network that had distributed axes across half the continent was severed. The knowledge of the custodian family, accumulated across uncountable generations, was partially lost to the disruptions of colonization. The stones from Mount William are still in the ground of those distant archaeological sites, inert now, disconnected from the network that placed them there, but testifying to something real. Number 7. The Calcadun stone fortifications. Go north. Far north into the dry ranges of northwest Queensland, where the Selwyn Range meets the semi-arid country around the modern town of Cloncurry and Mount Isa. This is hard country, rough quartzite ridges, dry creek beds, spinifex plains. The heat in summer is severe. The rain is sparse and unpredictable. It is the kind of country that demands toughness from everything that lives in it. The Calcadun people lived in this country for thousands of years. They were known, in the accounts of early settlers and pastoralists who encountered them in the 1870s and 1880s, as exceptional warriors, people of great physical capability, and fierce territorial commitment. The cattle industry that pushed into northwest Queensland in those decades brought it into direct and violent conflict with the Calcadun, who resisted with a coordinated ferocity that surprised the colonial forces. That resistance culminated in September 1884 at a ridge the colonists called Battle Mountain near Cloncurry. A large force of Calcadun warriors chose to make a stand at a rocky ridge whose natural stone formations provided cover and elevated position. The ensuing engagement, involving Queensland Native Mounted Police and a substantial contingent of armed pastoralists, resulted in catastrophic losses for the Calcadun. It was one of the largest and most violent engagements of the Queensland Frontier Wars. The reason this belongs in a discussion of Australian megaliths is what archaeologists have been finding in the Calcadun country since the late 20th century. The ridges and rocky outcrops that characterize the Calcadun landscape bear evidence of deliberate modification, stone walls built into natural ridge formations, structures that use the natural rock but extend it, enhance it, create defended positions that are more than just natural terrain features. The Calcadun were not simply using the landscape as it existed. They were modifying it, engineering it, building into the natural stone country structures that had both practical and potentially ceremonial functions. The scale of some of these modifications, the extent to which natural rock formations have been augmented with placed and stacked stone, suggests investment of significant labor over significant time. The archaeology of the Calcadun country is incomplete. The region is remote, the terrain is difficult, and the events of 1884 created a wound in community continuity that took generations to begin to heal. Research is ongoing, but what has been documented suggests that the Calcadun were, among many other things, stone builders, people who shaped their landscape in stone and who understood the military and social value of elevated, stone-built positions in their country. The story of Battle Mountain is not a story of primitive people caught in the open by superior technology. It is a story of sophisticated people choosing a terrain they had modified and understood, fighting from positions that reflected generations of knowledge about their own landscape. That they were defeated does not diminish what they built or what they knew. It tells you about the technology gap between flintlock firearms and traditional weapons. It tells you nothing about the intelligence or sophistication of those who chose to fight from stone positions in country they had shaped. Number 8. The Ngaut Ngaut archaeological sequence. Pause now. Come to South Australia, to the Murray River country above the town of Manor. Here the river cuts through sedimentary cliffs of pale yellow and cream, steep walls of compressed silt and clay that rise above the river corridor. In a cliff shelter at a place called Ngaut Ngaut, there are engravings cut into the soft rock, figures and symbols accumulated across thousands of years of continuous cultural use. The Nganguraku people, who are the traditional custodians of this place, say the engravings at Ngaut Ngaut represent a record, not just an artistic record, but a documentary one. Knowledge encoded in stone about the sky, about ceremonial practice, about the relationships between the human world and the world of ancestral forces that shape the land. The engravings at Ngaut Ngaut were formally studied by Norman Tyndale and Herbert Hale in the 1920s, making it one of the earliest systematically documented Aboriginal archaeological sites in Australia. Their estimates of age, based on the stratigraphy of the deposits and the rate of silt accumulation in the shelter, suggested occupation extending back at least 10,000 years. Later research extended that estimate significantly. What the Ngaut Ngaut site represents, beyond its own specific content, is a principle that applies across many Australian megalithic and archaeological sites. Stone does not decay. Rock art survives in sheltered locations across timescales that organic materials cannot. The engravings cut into rock by Aboriginal people 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago are still there, still legible to people who know how to read them. The stone is the archive. In a culture that did not use writing in any form recognizable to the Western tradition, stone was one of the primary media for permanent knowledge storage. The engravings, the arrangements, the alignments, the modified landscape features, these are texts. They store information about astronomy, about ceremony, about social organization, about the land and its resources, in a medium that resists the passage of time. To dismiss Australian stone structures as simple or unsophisticated is to misunderstand what they are and what they are doing. They are libraries. They are encoded knowledge stores. They are the permanent infrastructure of a civilization that chose to record itself not on clay tablets or papyrus or parchment, but on the rock of the land itself. Number 9. The Panaramitee tradition. There is a tradition of stone arrangement and rock engraving found across a vast region of interior Australia that archaeologists have named the Panaramitee tradition, after a station in South Australia where significant examples were first formally documented. The Panaramitee tradition is defined by a specific set of engraved motifs, tracks of animals, circles, arcs, dots, and related forms, that appear with remarkable consistency across thousands of kilometres of country. These engravings and associated stone arrangements are found in South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory. They share a visual vocabulary so consistent that researchers have argued for a connected cultural tradition spanning thousands of kilometres and tens of thousands of years. The Panaramitee engravings have been dated, by various methods, to between 10,000 and 40,000 years of age, with some sites potentially older. The scale of this distribution is important. When you find the same motifs, the same visual language, the same design system appearing at consistent intervals across an entire continent, you are not looking at isolated individual expression. You are looking at a shared cultural tradition maintained across vast geographic space over a period of time that dwarfs any comparable tradition in the archaeological record. This is continental-scale cultural coherence. It implies communication, exchange, shared ceremony, and shared knowledge between communities across the breadth of Australia, maintained over tens of thousands of years. It implies that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, for all the diversity of their languages and their local ecologies, shared something deep, something expressed in the marks they made on stone, that connected them to each other across the full extent of the continent. The Panaramitee tradition is not a footnote in the archaeology of Australia. It is evidence of one of the most spatially extensive and temporally deep cultural phenomena in the human record. There is nothing quite like it anywhere else in the world. There are comparable rock art traditions in Europe and Africa, but none that cover such a geographic range with such consistency over such a span of time. Understanding the Panaramitee tradition requires abandoning the image of isolated, small groups of people moving independently across a featureless landscape. The people who maintained this tradition were connected. They were in contact. They were part of something larger than any individual community, a pan-continental cultural network that used stone as its shared medium. Number 10. The Flinders Ranges stone circles. Come to South Australia again, to the Flinders Ranges. These are old mountains, very old, worn down from what must once have been dramatic peaks to the long, folded ridges and dry valleys of today. Red quartzite and slate, purple in certain lights, silver grey in others. Creek beds of white quartz pebbles, stands of river red gum, wedge-tailed eagles and yellow-footed rock wallabies. It is a beautiful and ancient place. The Adnyamathanha people have lived in the Flinders Ranges for thousands of years. They call their country Yata. Their stories about the land encode information about the geological history of the ranges, about the ancient inland sea that once covered much of South Australia, about the formation of the landscape by forces and events that happened long before any European arrived to watch. And across the Flinders Ranges, there are stone structures, stone circles of various sizes, some small and intimate, others large enough to have been meeting places for groups of significant size. Stone cairns marking specific locations that had ceremonial or practical significance. Stone walls guiding movement along paths that connected water sources across the dry country. Flat stones arranged in patterns that are not immediately legible, but that the Adnyamathanha elders say encode specific information about the landscape and its resources. The Flinders Ranges stone structures have not been as extensively studied as those in Victoria, partly because the research funding and academic attention that has been applied to sites like Wurdi Yuang and the Budgebim landscape have not been equally distributed across the continent. Australia is large. Its Aboriginal heritage sites are numerous beyond any complete catalogue. Many of them have been formally documented, but not yet deeply researched. What the Flinders Ranges sites represent is a principle repeated across the continent. Aboriginal Australians built in stone wherever stone was available. They modified their landscapes in stone for practical, ceremonial, and astronomical purposes. The practice was not confined to a region or a people. It was a continental pattern, adapted to local materials and local needs, but consistent in its fundamental character. The assumption that preceded serious research, the assumption that Aboriginal people did not build in stone because they were nomadic, and therefore left no permanent structures, was wrong because it reversed the causation. The question is not why they built in stone despite being nomadic. The question is why we assumed they were nomadic in the first place, given the evidence of stone construction that was sitting in the landscape all along. Number 11. The Pilbara and Murujuga. Go west now to the coast of Western Australia, to the Pilbara region where the Hamersley Range meets the Indian Ocean. Here, on a peninsula and on a scattering of offshore islands, is one of the most extraordinary concentrations of rock art in the world. Murujuga, also known as the Burrup Peninsula, carries engravings estimated at more than 1 million individual images. A million. The faces of the granite boulders that cover the peninsula are covered with figures, from top to bottom in many places, a visual record accumulated across a period of time that researchers estimate extends to 50,000 years or more. The images at Murujuga include animals that are no longer alive in the region or anywhere on Earth. There are engravings of thylacines, the so-called Tasmanian tiger, which was extinct on the Australian mainland at least 2,000 years ago. There are engravings of animals identified as megafauna, the giant creatures that populated Australia until the late Pleistocene, that vanished from the landscape between 30 and 50,000 years ago. If the identification of these animals is correct, and specialists in the relevant fauna broadly accept that it is, then some of the engravings at Murujuga were made when those animals were still alive. That would make them among the oldest figurative art in the world. The engraved boulders of Murujuga are not scattered randomly. There are locations where they are concentrated, where the density of images suggests repeated ceremonial use over long periods. There are alignments, stones arranged in relation to each other, and to the landscape in ways that suggest intentional spatial organization. There are areas where the distribution of specific motifs creates what appear to be compositional fields, connected groups of images that function together as a single statement. Associated with the rock art are stone structures, arrangements of rock that define spaces, cleared areas where boulders have been moved to create open ground, structures built from placed stone that are not immediately explicable as purely functional. The relationship between the rock art and these stone arrangements is not fully understood, but they clearly belong to the same cultural tradition, made by the same people or their ancestors over the same vast span of time. The Pilbara communities have been engaged in long-running efforts to protect Murujuga from the industrial development that surrounds it. The Burrup Peninsula is adjacent to the largest liquid natural gas processing facility in the Southern Hemisphere. Industrial acid emissions from these facilities have been implicated in the degradation of the rock surfaces that carry the engravings. The fight to protect Murujuga is ongoing, and it is a fight over something irreplaceable. If those engravings are damaged beyond recovery, something that took 50,000 years to accumulate will be gone. That is not a small thing. That is one of the great cultural heritage crises of our time, happening in a place that most people have never heard of. Number 12, the Quincan Galleries and the Cape York Stone Platforms. Now go north, far north, to the edge of Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, where the Cape York tableland breaks into the narrow rainforest and sandstone country approaching the tip of the continent. Near the town of Bora, in the Bora Sandstone, there are gallery sites of astonishing density and beauty. The Quincan Galleries contain thousands of rock art images, accumulated across thousands of years, representing a visual tradition of extraordinary complexity. Named for the Quincan, the spirit beings depicted in the art, these galleries document an unbroken artistic tradition in a landscape that humans have occupied for at least 45,000 years. The art is stratified. Older images disappear under newer ones. New images are placed in dialogue with older ones. The galleries are not static archives, but living documents, added to across generations by people who understood themselves to be participating in a tradition rather than starting one. Some images have been deliberately reworked, existing figures modified or extended. Some images are clearly ceremonial in function, figures associated with specific ritual contexts known from the oral traditions of the Anginara and related groups. Associated with the gallery sites are stone platforms, flat stone surfaces built up from the natural rock, level areas created by the placement and shaping of stone, which appear to have served as staging areas for ceremony, as gathering places for groups visiting the galleries. These are not natural features. They are built surfaces, created with deliberate labor to provide level ground in a rocky landscape. The stone platforms at the Quincan sites are not as well studied as some of the other stone structures we have discussed. They are harder to access, and the research focus on the Cape York region has understandably concentrated on the extraordinary visual art rather than the associated architectural features. But they are there, consistent with the broader continental pattern of stone construction associated with ceremonial and culturally significant sites. The relationship between rock art and stone architecture at sites like the Quincan Galleries raises an important question about how we classify Aboriginal cultural sites. We have tended to treat rock art and stone structures as separate categories, studying one without fully integrating the other, but in many cases they belong to the same cultural complex. The art and the built space existed in relationship, were used together, were part of the same ceremonial and social practice. Understanding that relationship fully requires the kind of integrated research that combines archaeology, art history, landscape analysis, and the knowledge of traditional custodians. It is a field that is still developing, still producing new understandings of sites that have been partially documented but never fully comprehended. Number 13. The Hawkesbury River engravings and sky maps, south now, south to New South Wales to the sandstone country north and west of Sydney, where the Hawkesbury River drains a landscape of flat-topped ridges, deep valleys, and sandstone platforms worn smooth by wind and water. The Hawkesbury sandstone region contains one of the densest concentrations of rock art in eastern Australia. Engravings, figures cut and pecked into the flat sandstone platforms that are exposed on ridge tops and beside watercourses throughout the region. The images include animals, human figures, fish, birds, and abstract forms. They are spread across thousands of individual sites, accumulated over a period of time that extends back at least 10,000 years, and probably much further. Among these engravings, researchers have identified images that appear to function as astronomical records, configurations of dots and circles that match the positions of specific stars or star clusters, figures positioned in relation to landscape features in ways that encode the direction of sunrise or sunset at specific times of year, images that appear to represent lunar phases or the movement of specific celestial objects across the sky. Dwayne Hamager and other researchers working on Aboriginal Australian astronomy have documented these astronomical engravings systematically, working with custodian communities to understand the knowledge traditions within which the engravings make sense. The picture that has emerged is of a sophisticated observational astronomy, embedded in the visual record of the Hawkesbury sandstone. The peoples of the Hawkesbury region watched the sky with the same attention they gave the land. They tracked the stars not for abstract philosophical reasons, but for practical ones. The rising and setting of specific stars and star clusters marked the seasons, announced the availability of specific food resources, indicated optimal times for specific activities. The sky was a calendar. The engravings on the sandstone platforms were notes from the calendar, reminders and records encoded in stone on the most durable surface available. Associated with some of the engraving sites are stone arrangements, cleared platforms where loose stone has been moved aside, arranged stones that define specific viewpoints for celestial observation, structural features that direct attention to specific points on the horizon where celestial events occur. These are not elaborate constructions in the manner of Wurdi Yuang, but they serve a similar purpose. They encode astronomical knowledge in stone, making the ephemeral observation of the sky into a permanent spatial record. The Hawkesbury engravings and their associated stone features represent, in concentrated form, something that is true of Aboriginal stone construction across the continent. It is not separate from astronomical knowledge. It is not separate from ecological knowledge. It is not separate from social and ceremonial practice. Stone construction in Aboriginal Australia was always embedded in a larger system of knowledge about the land, the sky, and the relationships between human communities and the world they inhabited. Number 14. What archaeology refused to see. It is time to ask the uncomfortable question directly. The evidence we have been discussing tonight is not new. Much of it was documented by the first Europeans to move through the regions where these structures exist. The journals of the explorers, the reports of the pastoral pioneers, the accounts of the first missionaries and government agents who made contact with Aboriginal communities across the continent are full of references to stone structures, fish traps, stone arrangements, cleared ceremonial grounds, and agricultural practices. Edward John Eyre saw the Brewarrina fish traps in the 1840s and described them in detail. Thomas Mitchell, exploring the western districts of Victoria in the 1830s, documented extensive evidence of organised land management and settlement. George Gray, exploring the Gascoyne region of Western Australia in 1839, found stone structures and what he described as houses in a landscape he had been told was empty. They saw, they documented, and then the record moved on because what they saw did not fit the story that the law required. Terra Nullius was not just a legal doctrine, it was a narrative infrastructure that shaped how evidence was interpreted, which observations were counted as significant and which were filed away or explained away. The legal definition of Terra Nullius in Australian courts, and the cultural narrative that supported it, required that Aboriginal Australians be understood as fundamentally different from other peoples who built structures, managed land, and organised communities. The stone traps, the stone villages, the stone arrangements, the agricultural management had to be explained as natural or as simple or as insignificant, because acknowledging them fully would have meant acknowledging that the legal and moral foundation of colonial Australia was built on a lie. This is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is the accurate thing. The archaeology of Aboriginal Australia was shaped for most of its history by a political requirement that it reach certain conclusions. The sites were documented, the evidence was present, but the interpretive framework that allowed the evidence to be understood for what it was did not exist, because building that framework would have been professionally and socially costly in a society organized around the premise of Terra Nullius. The shift began slowly in the 1960s and 1970s, as a generation of archaeologists began to push against the received narrative. Rhys Jones, John Mulvaney, Isabel McBride, and others began to document the true antiquity and complexity of Aboriginal cultural sites, with methods and frameworks that could not be dismissed as politically motivated. They found what the explorers had found a century earlier, and had not been allowed to properly understand. The shift accelerated after the 1992 Mabo decision, which legally overturned Terra Nullius and recognized that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had maintained continuous connection to their lands from before European settlement. The legal change created space for the intellectual change. Once the law acknowledged that Aboriginal peoples had always been here and had always had meaningful relationships with their land, it became possible for scholarship to more openly acknowledge what the land contained. Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu in 2014 brought the academic argument to a general audience. It was attacked because it was threatening. Arguments that do not threaten anything do not attract the kind of sustained critique that Dark Emu received. The critique focused on specific methodological points, some of them legitimate, while largely failing to engage with the overwhelming weight of archaeological evidence that supports the book's central argument. The central argument is simply this: Aboriginal Australians were not the nomadic, pre-agricultural people that the colonial record required them to be. They built, they farmed, they fished with permanent infrastructure. They lived in permanent settlements. They managed the land across continental scales with techniques and knowledge systems of great sophistication. They had astronomy, trade networks, architectural traditions, and cultural institutions of complexity comparable to any society in the ancient world. That argument is true. Not because Bruce Pascoe made it, but because the fish traps are in the Barwon River, and the stone villages are at Lake Condah, and the solstice alignment is in the paddock near Little River. Number 15, the dating problem. You might be wondering throughout all of this how we know how old these things are. It is a fair question. Stone does not decay in the way that organic material does, so the standard dating technique used for ancient sites, radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon-14 in once living material, is not directly applicable to stone structures. You cannot radiocarbon date a basalt wall or a granite fish trap. Archaeologists use several approaches to get around this problem. The first and most common is to date organic material found in association with the stone structures. If a fire was made inside a stone structure, charcoal from that fire can be radiocarbon dated. If food was prepared at a stone feature, organic residue from that preparation can sometimes be dated. If bone is found in the deposits immediately associated with the structure, it can be dated. The age of the organic material gives you a minimum age for the structure, since the structure must be at least as old as the activity that produced the organic material. The second approach is optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. This technique measures the last time specific mineral grains were exposed to sunlight. When mineral grains are buried, they stop being reset by sunlight, and a measurable signal begins to accumulate. When a geologist extracts those grains from the sediment and exposes them to specific light frequencies in a laboratory, the signal is released in proportion to the time since the grains were last exposed to sunlight. This gives you the age of burial, which tells you when the sediment was deposited and, by extension, approximately when the structure associated with that sediment layer was constructed. The third approach is circumstantial and contextual. Specific stone tools, specific art styles, specific faunal assemblages are associated with specific time periods, based on their presence at dated sites elsewhere. Finding those same tools or styles or fauna at a new site places that site approximately in the same time period. This is indirect but can be very powerful when multiple lines of contextual evidence converge on the same conclusion. For the major sites we have discussed, the dating is not based on a single technique or a single piece of evidence. The 40,000-year estimate for the Brewarrina fish traps draws on multiple lines of geological and archaeological evidence. The 6,600-year date for the Lake Condah system comes from OSL, dating of sediment associated with the main channels. The astronomical analysis of Wurdi Yuang, which suggests the arrangement is older than 5,000 years, based on the precession of the Earth's axis and the consequent slow drift of the solstice sunrise and sunset positions, is a geometric argument that does not depend on laboratory dating at all. The ages are not all equally well established. Some are solid, some are estimates with significant uncertainty. But the overall picture is clear. These are very old structures, built by people who had been in Australia for a very long time, and who brought to their building a depth of knowledge and practice accumulated across that time. Number 16. Encounters nobody documented. There is a vast category of evidence that no archaeologist will ever be able to fully reconstruct. It is the evidence of what was not recorded. European settlement of Australia was not a gentle process of gradual contact and careful observation. It was in most places and at most times a violent, rapid dispossession that destroyed community continuity, severed knowledge transmission, and killed the people who carried the most detailed understanding of the landscape they had built. The pastoralists who moved through the Western District of Victoria in the 1840s and 1850s needed the land for sheep. The stone villages of the Gunditjmara were in the way. The people who had built and maintained those villages, who knew their functions and their histories and their relationships to the surrounding landscape, were either killed, removed, or driven from their country in the space of a generation. The stone remained, the knowledge of it was broken. What was lost in that breaking is incalculable. Every stone arrangement in Australia was built with an associated body of knowledge, a story or set of stories that explained what the arrangement was for, how to read it, what protocols governed its use. Many of those stories survived because the communities that carried them survived, displaced and diminished but intact enough to maintain the thread. Many others did not. The stone at Murujuga is still there, a million images in granite, but the knowledge traditions that gave them specific meaning were damaged beyond full recovery in some cases by the industrial intrusion into the Pilbara and the violence of the pastoral frontier. What survives of the knowledge tradition at Murujuga is enough to know that what has been lost was significant. This is the real heritage crisis of Australian megaliths. Not just the physical damage to the structures, though that is real and ongoing, but the broken chain of knowledge transmission that once connected the stones to the minds that built them. Archaeology can date and describe. It can identify astronomical alignments with instruments. It can map trade networks from the distribution of stone types, but it cannot reconstruct from outside the full meaning of a stone circle to the people who built it, the story embedded in the arrangement, the ceremony associated with its use, the way it encoded and transmitted specific kinds of knowledge. The communities themselves are the only source of that understanding. The collaborative research models that have become more common in Australian archaeology in recent decades, research conducted with and by Aboriginal communities rather than on them, are recovering some of what was lost, matching stone features to oral traditions, connecting landscape modifications to knowledge practices that survived even when their physical contexts were damaged. But it is slow work, and the damage was deep. Number 17. Modern technology, ancient stone. What happens when you apply 21st century technology to 40,000-year-old stone? The answer, across the last 2 decades of research in Australian archaeology, is that you see things you could not see before, and those things consistently make the picture more complex and more impressive than the previous understanding. Satellite imagery and aerial survey, applied systematically to the landscape around Lake Condah in the early 2000s, revealed the full extent of the Budgebim aquaculture system. From the ground, individual features were visible, but their relationship to each other was not. From above, the coherence of the system, the way the channels and holding pools and weirs form a single integrated design across 80 square kilometers, becomes apparent. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to create detailed 3-dimensional maps of the landscape, has been used to survey areas of dense vegetation where ground-level survey is impractical. In forest country across northern Australia and Queensland, LiDAR has revealed stone features hidden under canopy that were previously unknown. The technology strips away the vegetation digitally and shows the shape of the ground beneath, revealing constructed features that could not be seen from the surface. Geochemical analysis, the chemical fingerprinting of stone types, has transformed the study of stone tool distribution and trade networks. Every significant stone source has a distinctive chemical signature, and that signature is preserved in tools made from it regardless of how far the tools have travelled. The continental distribution of Mount William greenstone axes was established by geochemical analysis, not by tracking historical trade routes. Archaeoastronomy, the systematic application of astronomical analysis to archaeological sites, has validated and quantified the astronomical precision of sites like Wurdi Yuang that had been suspected but not proven by earlier observers. When you model the position of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes from the position of the Wurdi Yuang arrangement, accounting for the slow drift of the solstice points caused by the precession of the Earth's axis, you can calculate which period the arrangement was set up in based on the current alignment of the marker stones. The mathematics are not simple, but they are not ambiguous. And genomic analysis, the study of ancient DNA from human remains and the genetic diversity of living populations, is providing a new dimension of evidence for the deep history of Aboriginal Australia. The genetic evidence supports occupation of the continent for at least 65,000 years by populations that remained relatively isolated from the rest of the world until quite recently. This is not a surprise to Aboriginal communities, who have known this all along, but genetic evidence has a way of penetrating scientific and public discourse that oral tradition has not always been able to achieve in the Western context. Each new technological tool applied to the archaeological record of Aboriginal Australia reveals more complexity, more antiquity, more sophistication. The pattern is consistent and has been consistent for 5 decades of modern research. Every time we look more carefully, we find more. That is not how the evidence would look if the colonial narrative were correct. If Aboriginal Australian culture had truly been simple and nomadic, careful looking would confirm simple and nomadic. Instead, careful looking consistently reveals a civilization of extraordinary depth, complexity, and antiquity. Number 18. The photography problem and the knowledge problem. There is a paradox at the heart of Australian megalithic studies that deserves its own discussion. The sites are documented, the evidence is overwhelming. The scholarly consensus has shifted decisively in the direction of acknowledging the sophistication and antiquity of Aboriginal Australian culture, and yet the public understanding of Australian prehistory has not kept pace. Most Australians, and most people in the wider world, still carry the image of Aboriginal Australian culture that the colonial narrative established: simple, nomadic, pre-agricultural, technologically basic. This gap between the scholarly record and public understanding is not an accident. It is the product of educational systems, popular media, and cultural institutions that have been slow to update their representations of Aboriginal Australian history. The museums have been changing, but slowly. The school curricula have been changing, but unevenly. The documentary tradition has been changing, but the image of the nomadic hunter-gatherer remains more culturally available than the image of the stone village builder or the astronomical observatory constructor. The knowledge problem extends to the sites themselves. Many of the most significant Aboriginal megalithic and archaeological sites are not accessible to the general public. They are on private land or in remote locations, or they have been deliberately restricted by custodian communities who have reasons not to share specific sites with the wider public. Ceremonial knowledge, in particular, is restricted in Aboriginal cultures in ways that make it unavailable to outside observers, regardless of their good faith. This means that the public experience of Aboriginal heritage is mediated, partial, and often focused on sites that are accessible and visually spectacular, rather than those that are most archaeologically significant. Uluru is known. The Brewarrina fish traps are not, outside a relatively small community of people with specific interest in the subject. Calcadun is known. The Lake Condah system was not widely known until the UNESCO listing in 2019, and even then the coverage was limited. The photography problem is different but related. The stone structures of Aboriginal Australia are not, for the most part, visually dramatic in the way that the pyramids or Stonehenge are visually dramatic. They are low to the ground. They are often partially overgrown or partially collapsed. They are built from the rock of the local landscape and therefore blend into it in a way that requires a trained eye or local knowledge to notice. You can walk through a complex of stone structures and not register them as structures at all. Stonehenge is recognizable from a kilometre away. The stone villages of Lake Condah require patient attention and contextual knowledge to see clearly. This is not because they are less significant. It is because they were built for different purposes by people with different priorities, and because the 200 years of neglect and damage have brought many of them to a state of partial collapse. Photographs of these sites do not do the work that photographs of the pyramids do. They do not immediately communicate grandeur or sophistication or scale. They communicate something subtler and harder to see: the deep integration of construction with landscape, the relationship between built structure and natural terrain, the way Aboriginal stone construction works with the land rather than against it. That subtlety is a form of sophistication, but it is not the kind that translates easily into the visual shorthand of popular culture, and so the sites remain underappreciated by the general public even as their significance becomes clearer to specialists. Number 19. What every theory gets wrong. There have been, over the years, various attempts to explain some of the more remarkable Australian archaeological sites in terms other than the straightforward one. The fish traps are sometimes attributed to natural geological processes. The stone villages are sometimes described as shelters of recent origin, with no cultural continuity. The astronomical alignments are sometimes dismissed as coincidence. And there is a persistent alternative tradition, thankfully less common than it once was, but still occasionally surfacing, that attributes extraordinary indigenous achievements to external influence, to Polynesian visitors, to ancient Egyptians, to any source other than the obvious one. All of these alternative explanations share a common flaw. They are less parsimonious, less consistent with the evidence, and more difficult to support than the simple explanation that the people who lived in Australia for 65,000 years built these things because they were capable of building them, because their civilization had developed over thousands of generations, the knowledge and organizational capacity to do so. The natural geological process explanation for the fish traps fails immediately on examination. The Brewarrina fish traps are not natural. They have wall designs that exploit the behavior of specific fish species. They have holding pools that fill and empty in coordination with river levels. They have components that require regular maintenance and that show signs of having been maintained. Natural processes do not build fish species-specific holding pools. The recent construction explanation for the stone villages fails on the dating evidence, the geological context, and the sheer quantity of labor represented by the budge-bim system. The channels of the Lake Condah system were not built recently. The OSL dates are not wrong by thousands of years. The coincidence explanation for astronomical alignments fails on the mathematics. The probability of the Wurdi Yuang arrangement being accidentally aligned to the solstices and equinoxes with the precision that has been measured is not significant. The probability is effectively zero. The alignment is intentional, and the external influence hypothesis fails on every possible line of evidence. There are no genetic signatures of significant external population admixture in the Aboriginal Australian gene pool until European contact. There are no artifact types that indicate sustained external cultural influence before that contact. There is no discontinuity in the archaeological record that would suggest the arrival of a new population bringing architectural or astronomical knowledge. The knowledge developed here, it was developed by the people who lived here. The Occam's razor of Australian prehistory is not complicated. The simplest explanation for why Aboriginal Australians built sophisticated stone structures is that they were sophisticated people who had been building things for a very long time. Every alternative explanation requires more assumptions, more suppressed evidence, and more special pleading than this one does. Number 20, the people who built them. We come now to the most important question, not what they built, or how old it is, or how we know, but who were they? The answer is the same answer that has always been waiting at the end of this story. They were the people who are still here. The Brewarrina people who built Wurdi Yuang have not disappeared. The Gunditjmara people who built the Lake Condah aquaculture system and the stone villages of the Western District are not a vanished culture known only from their artifacts. The Ngemba people whose ancestors engineered the fish traps at Brewarrina are alive. The Adnyamathanna people of the Flinders Ranges, the custodians of the Pilbara rock art, the Quincan Gallery custodians of Cape York, the Ngangaraku people of the Murray River cliffs, they are all still here. This is one of the things that makes Aboriginal Australian history fundamentally different from the archaeology of most other ancient civilizations. When archaeologists study ancient Egypt, the people of ancient Egypt no longer exist as a continuous cultural community. There are people living in Egypt today, but the specific cultural and social continuity of pharaonic civilization was broken more than 1,000 years ago. When archaeologists study Stonehenge, the specific people who built it are gone. We know very little about who they were. When archaeologists study the megaliths of Australia, the people who built them are sitting across the table. They have knowledge that no archaeological instrument can replicate. They know what some of the stones mean. They carry oral traditions that encode information about the structures that archaeology can confirm but cannot independently derive. They are not the past, they are the present. The 65,000 years of continuous occupation of Australia by Aboriginal peoples is not just a number. It is a continuity of culture, knowledge, relationship with land, and social practice that is without parallel in the human record. 65,000 years of accumulated knowledge about a specific landscape, transmitted generation to generation, refined and elaborated across an unbroken chain of people who knew each other, who learned from each other, who built on each other's understanding. The fish traps are 40,000 years old. 40,000 years of someone knowing how to build a fish trap on that river. 40,000 years of that knowledge being taught, corrected, expanded, passed on. 40,000 years of children watching adults repair the walls after the flood and learning which stones to place and where. 40,000 years of understanding accumulated in the practice of a single place. We do not have a word in English for that depth of relationship between a people and a place. We call it indigenous knowledge, and we sometimes call it traditional ecological knowledge, and we sometimes call it oral tradition. But none of those phrases fully captures what it is. What it is a civilization that chose stone and story and the land itself as its medium, rather than clay tablets and papyrus and cities of brick. It is the oldest civilization on Earth, not a simple one, not a primitive one, not a people frozen in time while the rest of the world developed around them. A people who developed alongside the rest of the world, in their own way, in their own place, across their own extraordinary span of time. The stones are still here, the people are still here. Both are asking you to understand something you were not told. Tonight, the asking's almost done. Take a breath. Let the weight of the numbers settle. 40,000, 65,000, 50,000. Numbers that represent not just time, but living human experience. Generation after generation, in a country of extraordinary beauty and difficulty. Building things in stone that are still standing after the world has forgotten who built them. Except the world has not forgotten. The Gunditjmara did not forget. The Wurdi Yuang did not forget. The Ngemba did not forget. They remembered everything. They carried everything forward through everything that was done to them, through dispossession and violence and forced removal, and the attempted erasure of their children's minds in mission schools. They carried the knowledge of the stones because the stones were their knowledge, their library, their calendar, their archive, their home, and now that knowledge is being heard. Slowly, incompletely, with the inadequacy that comes from trying to catch up with 200 years of willful blindness, but heard. That is something, that is more than nothing. That is the beginning of a long, necessary work of understanding, the work of seeing clearly what was always there to be seen, in a country full of ancient stone and ancient memory, and a people who were never what they were told to be. Outro. You have been with me a long time tonight. The country we have travelled, from the volcanic western district of Victoria to the Pilbara coast, to the Murray River cliffs, to the sandstone tablelands of the Hawkesbury, is a continent of extraordinary human depth. Every kilometre of it has been known and shaped and studied by people who have been here longer than anywhere else on Earth has been known. I hope something shifted for you tonight. I hope the word civilization feels different when you apply it to these places and these people. I hope the fish traps on the Barwon River and the stone villages at Lake Condah and the solstice markers at Wurdi Yuang are sitting in your mind with the weight they deserve. These are not minor stories from the edge of history. They are central to our understanding of what human beings are capable of, what a civilization looks like when it chooses stone and story rather than empire and conquest, what knowledge looks like when it is carried in people rather than written in books. If this conversation meant something to you, carry it forward. Find the work of the archaeologists and the historians and the Aboriginal scholars who have been making this argument in detail for decades. Find the Budgebim site and the Brewarrina fish traps and Wurdi Yuang on a map and understand that they are real places, accessible and existing, not in the past but in the present, tended by people who have never left. And if you are somewhere tonight where there is stone under your feet, old stone worn by time and weather, take a moment to wonder who knew it before you. They were probably more interesting than the history books told you. Sleep well. I will see you next time. Number 21. The Capy Valley Stones and the Question of Contact. There is a valley in New South Wales, west of the Blue Mountains, where the Capy River runs through sandstone country on its way to join the Colo. The valley is wide by the standards of the Western Escarpment, a broad, flat-floored basin ringed by high sandstone cliffs that glow orange and gold in the morning light. The river is bordered by river flats, dry in summer, sometimes flooded in winter, and the surrounding country is open woodland, grey box and apple box, and scattered casuarina. In this valley, there are sandstone outcrops bearing some of the most complex rock engravings in eastern Australia. The Capy engravings include human figures, animal tracks, circular forms, and compositions that suggest narrative content, images arranged in relationship to each other, in ways that tell something rather than simply depicting isolated subjects. The engravings are extensive, covering multiple rock surfaces across a wide area of the valley. And in association with some of the engraving sites, there are upright stones, sandstone slabs set into the ground at angles and positions that suggest deliberate placement rather than geological accident. The distribution of these upright stones in relation to the engraving sites and to each other follows a spatial logic that researchers have begun to analyze in terms of sightlines and astronomical orientations. The Capy Valley sites raise a question that comes up repeatedly in the study of Australian stone structures, the question of connection. Were the people who built stone arrangements in the Capy Valley connected, culturally and intellectually, to the people who built Wurdi Yuang in Victoria? Were the stone circles of the Flinders Ranges connected to the standing stones of Cape York? The evidence suggests yes, but not through direct contact or unified cultural identity. What connected them was something subtler and more interesting. A shared intellectual tradition of astronomical observation and landscape encoding in stone, developed independently in different regions, but sharing fundamental principles because those principles were derived from the same basic human practices of watching the sky and reading the land. When you watch the sky over a period of years, certain things become obvious. The sun rises and sets in different positions across the year. The positions at the extremes of its range are the solstices. The midpoints are the equinoxes. Different stars rise and set at different times of year. The moon follows a complex cycle that repeats across the years. These are not observations that require sophisticated instruments. They require patience, attention, and transmission of what has been observed. Any people who have lived in a place across multiple generations will make these observations. Any people who value the information those observations contain will find ways to preserve and transmit it. In a world without writing, the most durable medium for preserving spatial and astronomical information is the landscape itself, modified with stone to encode the relevant angles and alignments. The convergent development of astronomical stone construction across Aboriginal Australia does not require a single origin or a cultural transmission network, though such networks existed and transmitted many things. It requires only that many different peoples, across many different regions, face the same human problem of preserving astronomical knowledge in a durable form, and arrived at similar solutions because those solutions follow logically from the problem. This is what human intelligence does. It solves problems. Across 65,000 years of living in Australia, Aboriginal peoples solved an enormous range of problems. The fish trap is a solution to the problem of catching fish reliably. The stone village is a solution to the problem of durable shelter in a basalt country. The stone alignment is a solution to the problem of preserving astronomical knowledge across generations. Each solution reflects not primitive improvisation, but sophisticated understanding of materials, of natural processes, and of the specific challenges of the place. Number 22, the Guns Plains Enigma and the Tasmanian Isolation. There is a dimension to this story that has received less attention than it deserves, and it involves the island of Tasmania. Tasmania was part of the Australian mainland during the last ice age, when sea levels were approximately 120 metres lower than they are today. A land bridge connected the island to what is now Victoria, and people moved freely across it. When the Ice Age ended, approximately 12,000 years ago, sea levels rose, the land bridge flooded, and Tasmania became an island. The Aboriginal Tasmanians, cut off from mainland Australia for 12,000 years, developed in isolation. Their cultural and technological tradition evolved separately from the mainland tradition, in ways that are sometimes misunderstood as representing a simpler or more primitive stage of development. The truth is more complex and more interesting. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people developed a material culture adapted to the specific demands of a cool, wet, heavily forested island environment. They maintained fire stick management of the landscape, burning systematically to open the dense forest, create grassland for game, and manage the vegetation for human purposes, on a scale that was transforming the Tasmanian landscape long before European contact. They also built in stone, not in the same patterns as mainland cultures, because the problems they were solving were different and the stone available was different, but with the same fundamental orientation toward landscape modification that characterizes Aboriginal stone construction across the continent. Stone features in Tasmania include fish weirs on coastal rivers, cleared platforms at sites associated with ceremony, and cairn-like structures whose functions are not fully understood. The 12,000-year isolation of Tasmania provides a kind of natural experiment for understanding the independent development of cultural complexity. Whatever the Tasmanian Aboriginal people achieved, they achieved on their own, with no input from mainland Australia after the land bridge flooded. Their fish weirs and their landscape management represent an independently developed response to the challenges of their specific environment. This matters for understanding the broader argument about Aboriginal Australian civilization. Skeptics sometimes suggest that the sophistication documented at sites like Brewarrina or Lake Condah might reflect external influence, diffusion from populations in contact with other sophisticated cultures. The Tasmanian case makes this argument difficult. Tasmania was genuinely isolated. Its stone structures and landscape management practices developed without external input, and they show the same fundamental principles: organized labor, landscape modification, long-term knowledge transmission. The capacity for sophisticated organized construction is not something that was imported to Australia from outside. It is something that Aboriginal people developed here, independently, out of the same general human intelligence that produced construction traditions everywhere else in the world. Number 23, the astronomy of the Milky Way. There is a dimension of Aboriginal Australian astronomical knowledge that does not involve stone structures at all, or at least not obviously, but that illuminates the depth of the intellectual tradition within which those structures were built. Aboriginal Australian cultures across the continent have developed sophisticated astronomical traditions that extend far beyond what Western astronomy recognized as significant until quite recently. These traditions include not only observation of the sun, moon, and stars, but of what astronomers call dark constellation astronomy. In Western astronomical tradition, constellations are patterns formed by bright stars. The constellations of the Zodiac, Orion, Scorpius, the Southern Cross. These are patterns of bright points against the dark sky. Aboriginal Australian astronomy does the same thing with these star patterns, but it adds a dimension that Western astronomy neglected until the late 20th century. Aboriginal peoples across Australia also identify constellations in the dark patches of the Milky Way. Where Western astronomy sees a glowing band of stars, Aboriginal astronomy sees the dark nebulae within that band as figures. The emu in the sky, a figure formed by the dark dust clouds of the galactic plane whose body stretches across a large portion of the visible sky. The goanna, the eagle, the possum, figures traced not in bright stars but in the spaces between them. The emu in the sky is of particular interest because its orientation in the night sky changes across the year in a way that encodes seasonal information. When the head of the emu is visible at dusk, it marks the beginning of the season, when emus lay eggs, which can be harvested for food. When the body of the emu is visible, it marks the season when emus are nesting and not to be disturbed. The changing orientation of this dark figure across the year functions as a seasonal calendar of remarkable precision. There are stone engravings at some Australian sites that appear to represent the emu in the sky. There are specific landscape features at some sites that function as pointers to the position of the emu at key moments in its seasonal cycle. The astronomical knowledge tradition and the stone tradition are integrated. The stone encodes the sky knowledge. The sky knowledge is preserved in stone. Duane Hamaker and his collaborators have spent years documenting these astronomical traditions in partnership with Aboriginal communities and have published extensively on what they have found. The complexity and sophistication of Aboriginal Australian astronomical knowledge, both in the stellar tradition and the dark constellation tradition, has surprised every astronomer who has engaged with it seriously. This should not be surprising in itself. A people who have been watching the sky from the same latitudes for 65,000 years have had more time to observe and record astronomical phenomena than any other people on Earth. The precision and depth of what they have recorded reflects that time. The sky above Australia has been watched attentively, systematically, and with practical intelligence for longer than anywhere else on Earth. Number 24. Terra Nullius and its long shadow. Let us be specific about Terra Nullius, because the phrase appears throughout this story, and it deserves more than a passing reference. Terra Nullius is Latin for empty land, or land belonging to nobody. As a legal doctrine applied to Australia from the moment of British colonisation in 1788, it held that the continent of Australia was, legally speaking, empty of inhabitants in any recognised sense. The Aboriginal people who lived in Australia were acknowledged to exist, as the British could hardly deny the evidence of their own eyes, but they were held not to possess the land in any legal sense that required negotiation, purchase, or treaty. This doctrine had profound consequences. In North America, the colonial powers generally made at least nominal treaties with indigenous nations, however dishonest those treaties were in their operation. In New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi established at least a framework of legal relationship between the Crown and the Maori people. In Australia, there were no treaties. The land was simply taken, because the law said there was no one to take it from. The legal basis for Terra Nullius in the Australian context rested on a circular argument that was sustained by the suppression of inconvenient evidence. The doctrine held that Aboriginal people could not own the land because they had not improved it in any recognised sense, specifically because they had no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no built structures of consequence. But the evidence of agriculture, permanent settlements, and built structures of consequence was present from the beginning of the colonial record. It was simply not seen or not acknowledged because acknowledging it would have undermined the legal basis of the entire colonial enterprise. The Mabo decision of 1992, in which the High Court of Australia overturned Terra Nullius and recognised the existence of native title, was a legal revolution. It was also an implicit acknowledgement that the factual premise of Terra Nullius had always been false. The High Court did not need to go into detailed archaeological evidence. It needed only to recognise the obvious, that Aboriginal Australians had always maintained continuous and meaningful relationships with their land, as they had always said they had, as the stone structures in that land had always been telling anyone who was willing to look. The shadow of Terra Nullius falls across the archaeological literature as well as the legal literature. The interpretive frameworks that shaped Australian archaeology through most of the 20th century were developed within a context where the conclusion that Aboriginal culture was simple and nomadic was politically required. Researchers who reached different conclusions faced professional resistance that was not purely intellectual. They were challenging not just an archaeological interpretation, but a structure of legal and social power built on that interpretation. The slow revision of Australian prehistoric archaeology over the last 50 years is, in part, an intellectual story about new methods and new evidence and the accumulation of a weight of findings that can no longer be dismissed. But it is also a political story about the changing legal and social context that makes it possible to see the evidence clearly for the first time. What we can say now, with confidence that would not have been professionally sustainable in 1970, is that Australian Aboriginal civilization is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, that it was sophisticated, complex, and organised across continental scales, that it built permanent structures, managed land systematically, maintained astronomical knowledge of high precision, and sustained trade networks across a continent for tens of thousands of years, that it produced the oldest human constructions currently known, and possibly the oldest astronomical observatories, and one of the oldest and most extensive bodies of rock art. That is the true story of Australia's megaliths, not mystery, not anomaly, not evidence of lost races or ancient visitors. The work of people who knew what they were doing in a land they had known for longer than we can easily imagine. Number 25. What the Stones Remember. On a cold morning in July, at the latitude of southern Victoria, the sun rises very far to the north of its summer position. It comes up low, slow, at an angle that the stone markers at Wurdi Yuang were placed to frame. If you're standing at the eastern apex of the arrangement, looking west along the alignment, you can feel the precision of what those ancient builders achieved. The sun does not approximately hit the marker, it hits it exactly, as if the stone and the light had been waiting for each other across 7,000 years. There is something in that exactness that goes beyond archaeology, not mysticism, not the supernatural. Something human and precise and moving. Someone stood where you were standing in the early morning cold and watched the light fall on a stone they had placed and knew that it was right. They had measured and observed and calculated and built, and they had gotten it exactly right. And they knew that everyone who came after them would be able to stand in this same spot and look at the same light on this same stone and know what season it was and what was coming. That is a gift from one human mind to all subsequent human minds, not a gift preserved in writing, not a gift transmitted through literacy or numeracy in any form we would recognize from our own tradition, a gift built in stone, placed in the landscape, oriented to the light. The fish traps on the Barwon are the same gift, cast in a different medium. Someone solved the problem of how to catch fish reliably on a specific river, and embodied that solution in a structure of stone that 40,000 years of weather and flood and use has not fully destroyed. The people who use those fish traps, if they are ever fully restored, will be using the same solution that was found 40,000 years ago, refined and improved across generations, encoded in the arrangement of stones in a river. This is what the stones remember. They remember solutions. They remember knowledge. They remember the patient work of minds that took seriously the problem of how to live in a specific place across a span of time far longer than any individual life, and who built in stone so that the answer would outlast them. We are very late to this understanding. We have spent 200 years being unable to see what the stones contain. But the stones were patient, they are still here. And the people who put them here are still here too, still carrying knowledge that the stones can only gesture toward, still speaking a language of land and sky that the rest of us are just beginning to learn how to hear. The megaliths of Australia were built by people who should not have existed, according to the story that was told about this continent for 200 years. They built a solstice observatory, they built a fish trap system 40,000 years old. They built stone villages and continental trade networks, and an aquaculture system larger than anything comparable in the ancient world. They built all of this, and they're still here, and the stones are still standing. And the question that was never really a question has finally begun to receive the answer it always deserved. They built it because they could, because they had always been able to, because they had been here long enough to know exactly what they were doing. And now so do we. Number 26, the language of stone. Every civilization has chosen a medium. The Mesopotamians chose clay, pressing their cuneiform records into tablets that survived because they were baked hard by the fires that destroyed the buildings around them. The Egyptians chose limestone and granite, carving their records into the faces of monuments intended to last as long as the stone itself. The Chinese chose silk and bamboo and eventually paper, building an archival tradition of extraordinary continuity. The Greeks and Romans chose parchment, and their texts have survived in copies made by generations of monks and scholars who understood that the words were worth preserving. Aboriginal Australians chose the land itself. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is one of the most sophisticated choices a civilization can make, and it is a choice that reflects a profound understanding of what lasts and what does not. Clay tablets crack, papyrus rots in humidity, paper burns, silk deteriorates. Every archival medium that human civilizations have chosen to store their knowledge in is vulnerable to specific forms of destruction. Stone in the landscape is not invulnerable. It weathers. It is buried by sediment. It is sometimes deliberately destroyed by people who understand its significance and want to erase it. But it is more durable than any other medium that human beings have commonly used. The engravings at Murujuga have survived 50,000 years. The fish traps on the Barwon have survived 40,000 years of seasonal flooding. The stone walls at Lake Condah have survived 6,000 years of use, neglect, and the disruption of colonization. The choice of the land itself as the medium is also a choice about what knowledge is worth preserving and how it should be stored. In writing-based cultures, knowledge tends to be abstracted from its context, extracted from the place and the moment that gave it meaning and translated into symbols on a portable surface. The advantage of this is portability and reproducibility. The disadvantage is that meaning tends to leak out in the translation, and the relationship between the knowledge and the specific place it describes is weakened. Encoding knowledge in the landscape, by contrast, keeps the knowledge and its context in the same place. The astronomical alignment at Wurdi Yuang is not a text that describes the solstice. It is the solstice made visible in stone, located exactly where the astronomical event itself occurs. The fish trap on the Barwon is not a description of how to catch fish on this river. It is the solution to that problem, built into the river itself where the problem exists. This integration of knowledge in place is, in its own way, a more robust form of knowledge storage than anything that requires translation. The meaning cannot be lost in translation because the translation never happens. The stone is the knowledge, and the knowledge is the stone, and both are in the place where they matter. Understanding Aboriginal Australian knowledge systems as a form of sophisticated information storage, rather than as a primitive alternative to writing, requires a significant shift in how we think about intelligence, civilization, and the relationship between knowledge and medium. That shift is uncomfortable for people who have invested their sense of cultural superiority in the history of the written word. But the stones do not care about comfort. They continue to encode what they have always encoded. The solstice sunrise still falls on the same marker stones at Wurdi Yuang that it has fallen on for thousands of years. The eels still move through the channels of the Lake Condah system, following pathways that were engineered for them by people who are the ancestors of people who are alive today. The language of stone is slow and patient and very old. We are late students of it, but the lesson is still being given. Number 27. The eel trade and the Gunditjmara economy. Let us go deeper into what the Gunditjmara built at Lake Condah, because the aquaculture system is not simply a fishing technology. It is the foundation of an economy. The short-finned eel, the kuyang that the Gunditjmara managed so carefully, has a specific life cycle that made it extraordinarily valuable as a food resource. Eels live in fresh water for most of their lives, sometimes for decades, growing large and fat on the abundant invertebrate life of the wetlands. When they reach sexual maturity, which can take 20 or 30 years, they migrate to the sea, following watercourses to the ocean, and ultimately to spawning grounds in deep water to the east of Australia. They do not return. The adults that migrate out of the lake system do not come back. This means that a managed wetland population of eels is perpetually renewed by recruitment of young eels coming in from the sea, which grow and fatten in the wetland and is harvested as adults migrate out. The Gunditjmara did not simply catch eels opportunistically, they managed the population. The channels and holding pools of the Lake Condah system allowed them to control which eels were harvested and which were allowed to continue migrating and reproducing. They understood the life cycle of their resource, and they managed it accordingly. The eels were not only eaten fresh, they were smoked and dried for preservation, producing a high-protein food with excellent storage properties. Preserved eel could be traded over long distances. It could feed gatherings of people brought together for ceremony. It could sustain communities through seasons when other food was scarce. Heather Bilth, whose research on the Budge BIM system in the early 2000s was foundational to its UNESCO listing, documented evidence of an eel trade network that distributed preserved kuyang from the Lake Condah system across a wide region of southeastern Australia. The preserved eel moved through the same exchange networks that move Mount William greenstone axes and marine shell and other goods across the continent. An economy based on managed aquaculture producing a tradable preserved food surplus is not a subsistence economy. It is not the economy of a people living hand to mouth, following food across the landscape. It is the economy of people who have organized their relationship with a specific resource so effectively that they produce more than they consume, and who exchange that surplus through a network of relationships that creates interdependence and social cohesion across a wide region. This is precisely what the first cities in Mesopotamia did. Ur and Uruk were trading centers, processing and exchanging surplus grain from agricultural hinterlands. The Gunditjmara were doing something structurally analogous with eels, on a smaller absolute scale, but across a temporal depth that Mesopotamian civilization cannot approach. The comparison is not meant to flatten the differences between these two civilizations. They are profoundly different in many ways, but the fundamental economic logic, the management of a productive resource to generate a tradable surplus that supports complex social organization, is recognizable across both. And the Gunditjmara were doing it first. Number 28. The sacred geometry of the Bora rings. Across southeastern Australia, from Queensland through New South Wales and into Victoria, there are earthwork structures called Bora rings. A Bora ring, in its classic form, is a circular earthen bank, usually about 20 to 30 meters in diameter, with an entrance on one side. Sometimes there are two rings connected by a pathway, a larger outer ring and a smaller inner ring. The ground inside the ring is often cleared and leveled, or packed hard from long use. Bora rings were the sites of initiation ceremonies. The rituals conducted at them marked the transition of young men from childhood to adulthood, and they were among the most significant ceremonial events in the social calendar of southeastern Aboriginal communities. The initiation ceremony at a Bora ring was a major gathering event, bringing together people from multiple communities for days or weeks of ceremony, teaching, and social exchange. The rings are built from the earth that surrounds them, excavated from the perimeter to build the bank, which means they leave a negative impression in the ground as well as the positive one of the bank itself. This excavation and construction requires organized communal labor. The leveling of the interior requires sustained effort, and the creation of a pathway between two rings aligned to each other and sometimes to specific landscape features requires planning and measurement. Many Bora rings are associated with specific astronomical orientations. The entrance to the ring, or the alignment between two connected rings, is often found to point toward the rising or setting of a specific celestial body at a specific time of year that coincided with when the ceremony was traditionally held. Some rings are aligned to the same solstice and equinox positions that appear at Wurdi Yuang, encoded in a different medium but reflecting the same underlying astronomical tradition. The social function of the Bora ring extends beyond the initiation ceremony itself. The gathering at a Bora was an opportunity for trade, for the arrangement of marriages, for the resolution of disputes between communities, for the transmission of knowledge from elders to initiates and from one community to another. The ring itself, and the ceremony that took place within it, was the infrastructure of a continental-scale social network. Think about what that means. The Bora ring is not just a place of ceremony, it is a communications hub. It is the node in a network through which information, goods, social relationships, and cultural knowledge move between communities across a wide region. The ceremony creates the occasion for all of this. The ring is the physical site that organizes it. There are Bora rings that have been in use, or that show evidence of sustained use for thousands of years. The same location, used for the same purpose, across a span of time that makes the concept of institutional continuity in Western civilization look brief. A medieval cathedral in Europe might represent 500 years of continuous use. A Bora ring in Queensland might represent 10,000. That kind of institutional continuity requires something more than tradition. It requires active maintenance of both the physical structure and the social network that gives it meaning. Someone has to repair the banks when they erode. Someone has to ensure that the communities in the network still recognize the ring as the appropriate place for gathering. Someone has to maintain the protocols that govern conduct at the gathering and the ceremony. The continuity of the Bora ring is the continuity of the civilization that made it. Number 29, the Pacific context. We have been looking at Australian megaliths as if Australia were an island, isolated from the broader Pacific world. In some respects it was, but not in all respects. And placing the Australian megalithic tradition in its broader Pacific context reveals something important about the diversity of human approaches to stone construction. The Pacific is full of megaliths. The Moai of Easter Island are the most famous. Those enormous stone figures whose creation and transportation has been the subject of intense scholarly debate and popular fascination for decades. Less famous, but equally impressive, are the stone structures of Nan Madol in Micronesia, a complex of artificial islands built on a coral reef, using basalt columns up to 5 meters long and weighing up to 50 tons, the Ahu platforms of the Marquesas, the Marae of Polynesia, ceremonial platforms of dressed stone used for ritual gathering across a vast island region. These Pacific megalithic traditions are distinct from the Australian tradition in their visual character and their specific social functions. The Moai are figural monuments, the Marae are ceremonial platforms. The Nan Madol complex is essentially a city built on water. The Australian traditions are astronomically and ecologically oriented in ways that the Polynesian traditions are not, and the Australian traditions are immeasurably older. But they share a fundamental principle. They represent societies that understood the relationship between permanent construction and social power, between the ability to organize large-scale communal labor and the maintenance of cultural authority. The leaders who directed the construction of a Bora ring or a fish trap system or a stone alignment were demonstrating their organizational capacity and their cultural knowledge, just as the leaders who directed the construction of a marae or an ahu were demonstrating theirs. The Pacific megalithic traditions emerged much more recently than the Australian ones, mostly within the last 2,000 to 4,000 years. They represent the downstream expression of the same fundamental human capacity for organized stone construction that the Australian traditions had been developing for tens of thousands of years, before the first Polynesian settlers reached the islands of the Pacific. This is not to claim a direct historical connection between Australian Aboriginal stone construction and Polynesian megalithic traditions. The connection is not direct. It is the connection of a shared human capacity, expressed at different times and in different cultural contexts, producing different results that nonetheless reflect the same underlying organizational and intellectual achievement. What Australia adds to the Pacific picture is time, not sophistication in isolation, but sophistication in the context of a temporal depth that no Polynesian megalithic tradition can approach. The Aboriginal Australian stone tradition is the oldest large-scale stone construction tradition in the world. When the builders of Nan Madol were dragging basalt columns across their coral reef, the Gunditjmara had already been managing eels in stone channels for 4,000 years. Number 30. The children who will never forget again. There is a school curriculum debate in Australia that has been ongoing for decades and that has recently been shifting in significant and important ways. The question is what Australian children are taught about the civilization of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and specifically whether they are taught a story that does justice to the depth and sophistication of that civilization. For most of the 20th century, the answer was no. Australian children were taught a version of Australian prehistory that was shaped by the colonial narrative. They learned about the Dreamtime as a collection of creation myths, rather than as a sophisticated knowledge system embedded in the landscape. They learned about hunter-gatherers without agriculture or permanent settlements. They learned very little about the fish traps, the stone villages, the astronomical observatories, the continental trade networks. The curriculum revisions of recent decades, accelerated by the mandatory inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives across all areas of the Australian curriculum introduced in 2013, have begun to change this. Children are now more likely to learn about the Ngemba fish traps, about the Gunditjmara aquaculture system, about the astronomical alignment at Wurdi Yuang than their parents were. This matters enormously, not only for the Aboriginal children who grow up in a school system that finally acknowledges the depth and sophistication of their ancestors' civilization, but for all Australian children who deserve to understand what kind of country they're growing up in, what kind of human history they are inheritors of, what kind of civilization preceded the one they know. Australia is not a young country with a short history. It is the oldest continuously inhabited place on Earth, carrying within its landscape and within its living communities the evidence of the longest unbroken human story anywhere on the planet. Teaching children this is not an act of political accommodation or cultural sensitivity. It is an act of historical accuracy. When Australian children understand that the Brewarrina fish traps are 40,000 years old, they understand something about time and human achievement that is difficult to convey in any other way. They understand that the people who built those traps were not different from them in any fundamental way. They understood engineering, they understood river ecology, they understood the problem of catching fish reliably, and they solved it in stone. They were intelligent, curious, practical people who applied their intelligence to the specific challenges of their place and time. This understanding does not diminish European achievement. Newton's calculus is still remarkable. The Gothic cathedrals are still extraordinary. The Renaissance is still beautiful. But the Aboriginal fish trap is also remarkable. The stone village is also extraordinary. The astronomical alignment is also beautiful. There is no scarcity of human achievement that requires any civilization to be diminished in order for another to be celebrated. The children who learn this full story will be the generation that finally sees Australia clearly. Not the Australia of Terra Nullius, not the Australia of the empty land, not the Australia of the primitive nomad. The Australia that actually exists, full of stone and memory in the oldest civilization on Earth, ready finally to be understood. Number 31. Standing at the stone. This is the last thing I want to tell you tonight. If you have the opportunity, go to Wurdi Yuang, or go to Brewarrina, or go to Lake Condah. Go to a place where the stone is still in the ground, and the alignment is still true, and the knowledge is still encoded in the placement of rock that human hands set down thousands of years ago. Stand in that place for a while, not to photograph it, though photographs are fine. Not to consume it as a tourist attraction, though that is also fine. Stand there to feel the dimension of time that the stone represents. 7,000 years for Wurdi Yuang, 6,600 years for Lake Condah, 40,000 years for Brewarrina. Let those numbers move through you slowly, the way the light moves across the stones at dawn. The person who placed the marker stone at Wurdi Yuang was a person. They woke up in the morning and felt hungry and felt cold and thought about the work ahead. They had a community of people they were responsible to and people they were responsible for. They had knowledge that had been given to them by someone older, and they understood that they were responsible for giving that knowledge to someone younger. They understood that what they were building would outlast them, that they were building for people they would never meet. That is not different from what architects and engineers and teachers do today. The specifics of the knowledge are different. The medium is different. The social context is unimaginably different from anything most of us know. But the act of building something for the future, of encoding knowledge in durable form, of taking seriously the obligation to the people who come after you, that is a human act. It is not a primitive act or an advanced act. It is simply a human one. Standing at the stone, you are in the presence of that act. The builders are not there, but what they built is. And what they built carries the clear mark of intelligence and intention and care. The same qualities that any builder brings to any act of making something that will last. Let that be what you take away from tonight. Not the numbers, though the numbers are important. Not the sense of grievance at what was suppressed, though that grievance is legitimate. Take the simple recognition of intelligence. Take the willingness to look at a stone placed by human hands 40,000 years ago and recognize in its placement the unmistakable signature of a mind that was doing something on purpose. That recognition, that extension of intelligence and intention across the full span of human time and the full diversity of human expression, is the beginning of understanding what it actually means to be human, not the narrow, recent, literate, urban, Western version of human, the full version. The 65,000-year stone building, sky watching, fish trapping, eel trading, solstice marking, continent spanning version. All of us are that. Every culture on Earth is the descendant of people who did extraordinary things without the tools that we think of as the prerequisites of extraordinary achievement. Every civilization is built on a foundation of intelligence and ingenuity that predates civilization by a very long way. Australia is just the place where the foundation is oldest and deepest, and where the people who laid it are still alive to tell you what it means. Sleep now. Dream of stone and light and the long patience of the builders. I will see you again next time. Number 32, the Mallee country and the low stones. There is a region of southeastern Australia called the Mallee, named for the hardy, multi-stemmed eucalypts that dominate its vegetation. It extends across the northwestern corner of Victoria, into South Australia, and into the southwestern corner of New South Wales. It is flat, hot, dry country. The soil is sandy, wind-blown, unstable. The trees are low and dense. Water is scarce. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius. This is not country that announces itself to the outsider as a place of profound cultural depth. There is no dramatic scenery. There are no obvious landmarks. It is the kind of country that a traveller moves through quickly, if they travel through it at all, seeking the more legible landscapes of the coast or the highlands. But the Mallee is ancient human country. The Aboriginal peoples who lived in it, including the Wagaya, the Wotjobaluk and the Lachilache, among others, understood this landscape with the precision that comes from tens of thousands of years of continuous presence. They knew the locations of water in dry seasons. They knew the seasonal movements of game through the mallees. They knew the plants that were edible, medicinal, or useful in specific ways. They knew where the stone was in a landscape where stone is not common, and they used it. Stone arrangements in the Mallee are low and subtle. The country does not have the basalt of Western Victoria, or the sandstone of the ranges. What stone exists is small and often scattered. But stone arrangements are there, circles and alignments built from the materials available, modest in scale by comparison with Wurdi Yuang or the Lake Condah walls, but consistent in their evidence of intentional construction and spatial organisation. The Mallee stones raise a point about how we assess the significance of Aboriginal stone construction that is worth making explicitly. We have a tendency, shaped by the visual culture of Western monument appreciation, to value larger and more dramatic structures over smaller and subtler ones. Stonehenge is more impressive than a low stone circle in a dry woodland. The pyramids are more impressive than the modest stone cairns that mark significant locations in the South Australian ranges, and so the smaller and subtler structures are often undervalued, studied less thoroughly, funded less generously. But significance is not a function of size. A small stone arrangement in the Mallee that marks a water source, encodes astronomical information, and has been maintained by a community across thousands of years, is not less significant than a large stone alignment in Victoria. It reflects the same human capacity for organised construction and knowledge encoding, adapted to the specific conditions of its place. The Mallee stones are a reminder that the megalithic tradition of Aboriginal Australia is continental, not only in the geographic distribution of its major monuments, but in the pervasive presence, across virtually every part of the continent where stone is available, of deliberate human modification of the landscape in stone. This is not a tradition confined to specific special places. It is the landscape-wide expression of a civilization that used stone as one of its primary languages wherever stone could be found. Number 33. The Volcanic Legacy. Much of the most extensive and most studied Aboriginal stone construction in southeastern Australia is found in volcanic landscapes, and this is not a coincidence. Volcanic geology produces specific kinds of stone that are well suited to construction. Basalt, the dominant rock of the Western Victorian volcanic province, is dense, heavy, and breaks into flat slabs along regular planes of cleavage. It is not a stone that needs to be shaped by skilled stonework. It presents itself in forms that are directly usable in construction: flat pieces for paving or for wall faces, angular chunks for wall cores, irregular lumps for fill. A builder working with basalt has a material that cooperates with construction ambitions in ways that granite or sandstone do not. The Gunditjmara at Lake Condah had an extraordinary material advantage. The ancient lava flows of their country had deposited thousands of years' worth of basalt rubble across the landscape in forms that were essentially pre-sorted construction material. The channels of the aquaculture system were built from this material. The walls of the stone villages were built from it. The weirs and holding pools were built from it. The material was everywhere, in the right sizes and the right shapes, requiring labour to move, but not requiring skilled craftsmanship to shape. The Wurdi at Wurdi Yuang also worked in volcanic country. The basalt stones of the arrangement were moved from nearby outcrops to their current positions. The effort of moving a basalt stone that weighs several hundred kilograms is significant, but not extraordinary. What is extraordinary is the sustained community commitment to moving enough of them in the right places to create a 50-metre arrangement with the astronomical precision of the finished product. The volcanic legacy gave the people of Western Victoria a material advantage in stone construction that peoples of other geologies did not have. This explains, at least in part, why the most extensively studied and best preserved Aboriginal stone structures are concentrated in this region. It does not explain the knowledge and organisation that created those structures. Those are cultural achievements, independent of the material available. In regions where basalt is not available, Aboriginal peoples worked with what the landscape provided. In the sandstone country of the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury, they worked in sandstone, carving rather than building, encoding knowledge in the flat surfaces of exposed rock rather than in freestanding or piled structures. In the granite country of the Pilbara, they did the same, exploiting the exposed faces of boulders as surfaces for engraved record-keeping on a massive scale. In the limestone country of the far west, they used the flat surfaces of the plateau and the painted walls of caves. The medium varied with the geology. The practice was constant. Across the entire continent, wherever a durable stone surface existed, Aboriginal peoples found ways to encode knowledge and mark the landscape with the evidence of their presence and their intelligence. Number 34. The role of women in stone building. The history of stone construction in Aboriginal Australia, as in many other fields of historical inquiry, has been told from a perspective that tends to center male ceremonial authority and male knowledge systems. The Bora ring was a site of male initiation. The custodian of the Mount William quarry was male. The builders most often discussed in connection with stone arrangements are implicitly assumed to be male. But the reality of how labour was organised in Aboriginal societies is more complex than this. The construction of permanent stone features required the sustained labour of communities, not of specialist male builders alone. Women carried stone. Women maintained and repaired construction features associated with food production. Women held knowledge about the landscape and its resources that was encoded in stone and landscape features in ways that are only beginning to receive systematic documentation. The Gunditjmara aquaculture system is a particularly instructive case. The processing of eels for preservation and trade was, in many documented accounts, primarily women's work. The smoking and drying of eel, the preparation of preserved eel for storage and exchange, the management of the food production system in its daily operational aspects, these were not the activities of a passive household economy supporting a male-dominated public sphere. They were skilled, knowledge-intensive activities that were essential to the functioning of the overall system. The knowledge of how to smoke eel correctly, how long to dry it, how to assess whether it was adequately preserved for long-distance trade, was specialized knowledge of economic and social importance. It was knowledge encoded in practice, transmitted from older women to younger women, across generations of the community living at Lake Condah. The physical landscape modifications associated with the eel processing, the specific locations where processing was done, the features associated with the smoking process are part of the cultural landscape of Budj Bim in ways that are increasingly recognized. The UNESCO World Heritage listing acknowledges the cultural landscape of the Gunditjmara as a whole, not only the engineering of the channels and weirs that tends to dominate the popular description of the site. Recovering the full picture of women's roles in Aboriginal stone construction and landscape management requires working closely with communities, with the knowledge holders who maintain the specific traditions, and with a scholarly framework that resists the tendency to locate significance primarily in the dramatic and the monumental. Number 35. The living archive. We have talked much tonight about stone as an archive, about the way Aboriginal Australian civilization stored knowledge in permanent landscape modifications. But the stone is only one layer of the archive. The other layer is the people themselves. Oral tradition in Aboriginal cultures is not the rough and imprecise thing that the phrase sometimes implies to people from literate cultures. It is a sophisticated technology of knowledge transmission, developed across thousands of years of deliberate practice, capable of preserving specific, accurate information across timescales that writing has not yet achieved. The songlines of Australia are the most discussed example of this. The songlines, or dreaming tracks, are narrative and musical routes that connect locations across the landscape, encoding geographic, ecological, astronomical, and historical information in songs that can be sung by people moving through the country. The songs contain the names of places, descriptions of landscape features, information about water sources and food resources, accounts of the actions of ancestral beings that explain the origins of landscape features, and a great deal of more specific local knowledge that has not been systematically documented. A person who knows the song for a particular route across country knows, in encoded form, the location of every water source on that route, the timing of seasonal resources available along it, the protocols for conduct at each significant place it passes through, and the social relationships between the communities whose country the route traverses. This is an enormous amount of practical information encoded in a mnemonic system that can be carried entirely in the human mind. The songs are the medium, the landscape is the library. The correlation between the song and the landscape is exact enough that people who know a song can navigate the country it describes accurately, even in country they have never physically visited, because the song describes the landscape in sufficient detail. The endurance of this system is extraordinary. There are researchers who argue that specific songlines preserve accurate information about landscape features that existed before the sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago. If this is correct, the songlines carry information that predates writing by 7,000 years and predates the pyramids by 7,000 years. Information accurate enough to describe specific landscape features that have not existed for 12 millennia. The evidence for this claim is found in the specific content of some songline narratives, which describe landscape features, coastal features in particular, that correspond to features of the now submerged continental shelf. If the descriptions are accurate, they preserve memory of a time when Australia's coastline was very different from today's, when the sea was much further away, when the landscape described in the songs was the landscape people actually walked. This would make the songlines the most ancient archival system on Earth by a very large margin. Whether or not the oldest claims can be fully substantiated, the principle is clear. Aboriginal Australians developed a knowledge transmission technology of extraordinary sophistication and durability. That technology is not writing, it is song, story, ceremony, and landscape. It encodes information in human memory and in the physical world simultaneously, cross-referencing each against the other in a system that is more robust than either alone. The stone is the stable anchor, the song is the living transmission. Together they form an archive that has no equivalent anywhere else in human history. Number 36. Why this matters now. We are having this conversation in a world where the relationship between human civilization and the natural systems that sustain it is under acute stress. The ecological crises of the 21st century, climate change, biodiversity loss, soil degradation, freshwater depletion, are all, in various ways, consequences of the dominant civilizational model of the last 2 centuries, the model of industrialization, resource extraction, and the treatment of nature as a raw material for human use. Aboriginal Australian civilization offers a different model, not a romanticized pastoral return to nature fantasy, a real, documented, sophisticated civilization that maintained productive, sustainable relationships with specific ecological systems across timescales that no other civilization has approached. The Lake Condah eel system was productive for 6,600 years. If it is ever fully restored, there is every reason to believe it would be productive again. The knowledge of how to manage it is not lost. The ecological system it exploited still exists. The people who built it are still here. The Brewarrina fish traps have been on the Barwon River for 40,000 years. 40,000 years of eel and fish production from a single river, managed by people who understood the ecology of that river well enough to not exhaust it across an unimaginable span of time. The contrast with the history of industrial fisheries, which have reduced global fish populations to a fraction of their pre-industrial levels in less than a century, does not need to be spelled out. Aboriginal land management techniques, including firestick farming, the strategic burning of the landscape to renew vegetation, redirect game, and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire, are increasingly recognized by ecologists and land managers as sophisticated and effective responses to the specific ecology of the Australian landscape. The catastrophic bushfires that have become more frequent and more severe in the era of European land management reflect, among other things, the abandonment of the burning regime that Aboriginal Australians maintained for tens of thousands of years. The stone is part of this story too. The fish traps and the aquaculture channels and the managed wetlands are not only cultural achievements, they are ecological infrastructure. They create habitat, they manage water flow, they support biodiversity in ways that their builders understood and managed intentionally. Restoring them is not only a cultural act, it is an ecological one. The people who built these things across 65,000 years knew something about long-term sustainable relationship with a specific landscape that industrial civilization urgently needs to learn. The knowledge is not abstract or theoretical. It is encoded in stone and song and practice and the living memory of communities who have been in relationship with their country since before the end of the last ice age. This is why it matters now. Not only as history, though it is profound history. Not only as justice, though it demands justice, but as practical knowledge that the 21st century cannot afford to dismiss about how to live in a place for a very long time without destroying it. The stones are telling us something. It is time to listen. Number 37. The continuing work. The archaeology of Aboriginal Australia is not a closed chapter. It is an open and rapidly developing field, and the pace of new discovery and reinterpretation has been accelerating since the 1990s. Every year brings new sites, new dating results, new technologies applied to existing evidence, new collaborative projects between researchers and communities that recover knowledge once thought lost. The deep history of Aboriginal Australia is not finished being uncovered. In 2020, a team of researchers working in the Pilbara confirmed human occupation of a rock shelter called Majid Baby in the Northern Territory at approximately 65,000 years before present, pushing back the demonstrated antiquity of human presence in Australia by more than 10,000 years and making it one of the oldest confirmed human sites outside Africa. The research was conducted in partnership with the Mirarr traditional owners, who were not surprised. They had always known their people had been there from the beginning. In the same period, researchers working on the continental shelf of northwest Australia, in areas now submerged under the Indian Ocean that were dry land during the Ice Age, have been developing remote sensing techniques to identify possible archaeological sites beneath the water. If structural features comparable to those found on the contemporary landscape are found in those submerged areas, the geographic and temporal scope of Aboriginal stone construction will need to be extended further still. The dating of existing sites continues to be refined. As OSL dating technology improves, as new dating techniques become available, as the analysis of sedimentary context becomes more sophisticated, the age estimates for key sites are being extended. What was dated to 10,000 years 20 years ago may be dated to 20,000 years today. The trend consistently has been toward greater antiquity rather than lesser. New sites are being documented. Not spectacular new sites in unexpected locations, but the systematic completion of the work of identifying and recording the full extent of what is already there. The distribution of stone arrangements, rock art, landscape modifications, and archaeological deposits across the continent is still incompletely mapped. There are regions where the work has barely begun. There are sites known to local communities that have never been formally documented because no researcher with the appropriate training and community trust has worked in those areas. The work is enormous. The continent is enormous. The heritage it contains is enormous. The capacity of the research community to study it, even with the significant increase in Aboriginal archaeology that has occurred over the last 30 years, is still not equal to the scale of the subject, but the work is being done. And every new finding adds to the picture that is emerging, the picture of a civilization of extraordinary depth and sophistication, older than any other on Earth, still living in the country it has always known, still carrying knowledge that the stones can only partially express. The stones were patient for 40,000 years. The knowledge was maintained through catastrophic disruption. The people who carry both are still here. Now the rest of the world is finally beginning to pay attention. That is where we are tonight, at the beginning of a long overdue understanding, in the presence of the oldest civilization on Earth, whose stones have been waiting in the landscape for precisely this moment. The moment when someone who had been told there was nothing there finally looks up and sees what was always standing in plain sight. The megaliths of Australia were built by people who should not have existed, according to the story that was told. But the story was wrong. The people were always there, the stones were always there, and they are there still, patient and permanent and full of everything they have always known, waiting for you to understand. Sleep now, the stones will be there in the morning. A final note on the record. There is one more thing that should be said before this conversation ends, and it is not about any specific site or any specific piece of evidence. It is about the nature of what you have heard tonight and what it asks of you as a listener. The history of the suppression of Aboriginal Australian cultural achievement is not a comfortable history. It is not a history that can be acknowledged and then moved past without consequence. It is a history that is connected to ongoing realities, to the question of land rights and sovereignty, and the recognition of prior ownership and the legal and social standing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in contemporary Australia. The fish traps at Brewarrina were built by the ancestors of people who, within living memory, were not counted in the Australian census as citizens. The stone villages at Lake Condah were built by people whose descendants were removed from the country of those villages within the last 100 years, taken to missions and stations far from the lands their ancestors had managed for 6,000 years, as part of a policy of forced assimilation that the Australian government formally acknowledged as a crime against humanity in the 2008 National Apology. The stones and the politics are connected. Understanding the stones fully requires understanding what was done in the effort to make them invisible, and understanding what was done requires grappling with its present-day consequences. This is not to say that every conversation about Aboriginal Australian archaeology must become a political conversation. The fish traps are remarkable in themselves, as engineering, as evidence of sustained human intelligence applied to a specific ecological problem, across an extraordinary span of time. The astronomical alignment at Wurdi Yuang is remarkable in itself, as astronomy, as evidence of precise observation and clever encoding of celestial knowledge in stone. These achievements do not need political context to be impressive, but the full story of why we are only now, in the early 21st century, beginning to fully acknowledge and understand these achievements, that story requires the political context. It requires knowing about Terra Nullius and what it demanded of archaeology. It requires knowing about the systematic suppression of Aboriginal culture that accompanied colonization. It requires knowing about the efforts of Aboriginal communities, sustained across generations of dispossession and disruption, to maintain knowledge of the stones and what they meant. The stones themselves are politically neutral. They were placed by people who were not thinking about what Europeans would think of them 400 years later. They were placed by people who were thinking about solstices and fish and eels and community and the people who would come after them. But we who look at them now are not politically neutral, and pretending that we are is its own form of suppression. We look at them with the eyes of people shaped by a specific history, a history that decided for a long time that these stones were nothing, that the people who built them had done nothing worth acknowledging, that the land was empty and available. That history is part of who we are. Acknowledging the stones means acknowledging the history of their suppression, and acknowledging the history of their suppression means accepting some responsibility, as inheritors of that history, for what comes next. What comes next is the sustained, serious, properly funded, community-led work of fully documenting, protecting, restoring, and understanding the megalithic heritage of Aboriginal Australia. It is the work of listening, really listening, to the people who have always known what the stones mean, and of ensuring that what they know is recorded and preserved and transmitted in forms that can survive the ongoing pressures of development, climate change, and the passage of time. It is the work of making the invisible visible, not as an act of charity or condescension, but as an act of historical accuracy, of finally seeing what was always there to be seen. The stones have been waiting. The people who built them have been waiting. The understanding they have always carried has been waiting. Now the waiting is almost over. Sleep well and dream of ancient stone in morning light and the long, long patience of the builders. The deep root. If you remember only one thing from tonight, let it be this. The oldest human-made structures on Earth are not in Egypt. They are not in Mesopotamia. They are not in Europe or Asia or the Americas. They are in Australia. They were built by people who have maintained an unbroken cultural continuity from the moment of their creation to this present night. The builders are gone, as all builders eventually go, but their descendants are alive. Their knowledge is carried forward. The thread was threatened and damaged, but never fully severed. That is an extraordinary fact. It is arguably the most extraordinary fact in human history. A civilization that has maintained cultural continuity for 65,000 years, that has been building in stone for 40,000 of those years, that has watched the sky and encoded what it saw in stone and song across a span of time that encompasses the entire history of every other civilization on Earth, is alive and present and speaking, if you're willing to listen. The megaliths of Australia are not ruins. Ruins are the remnants of dead civilizations. These are the constructions of a living one, tended and maintained and interpreted by people who have never left the country where their ancestors built them. That is what was always there. That is what the story of the empty land was designed to prevent you from seeing. Look at it now. It has been waiting long enough.